The moment I stepped through those courtroom doors, my daughter's lips curled into a smirk, and my son-in-law dismissed me with a slow, contemptuous shake of his head. Simple farm clothes on my back, worn-down boots on my feet, an old cap turning in my hands, I had the look of a man who'd wandered in from the wrong building. I caught Nadine lean toward Clifton and murmur something low, and that familiar arrogance spread across his face like he'd already won. Then came her laugh, strangled, barely contained, and it drove straight into my chest. That was what I was to them, a nuisance, an old fool who had no place standing before a judge. Then the judge lifted his eyes from the bench and found mine. What happened next, I will never forget. The blood left his face all at once, his hand seized up around the gavel, and whatever words formed on his lips came out barely above a breath. Yet they killed every sound in that room. "My God," he said. "Is it really him?" Every head swung toward me. The quiet pressed in so hard I could hear my own pulse. Nadine's smirk dissolved. Clifton's brow furrowed his eyes, cutting between me and the judge, like a man watching something he couldn't explain. Neither of them had the faintest idea of who they were truly dealing with. Not yet. My name is Gordon Whitfield. I am 70 years old, and I am still somehow mending from what my own family did to me. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into what I have to share with you, I'd love to know something small. Are you listening on headphones right now, or letting it play through a speaker? There's something about a story this close to the bone that feels different, depending on how it reaches you. Go ahead and drop it in the comments. It only takes a second. Now, a brief note, some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real persons or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. It all started 3 months ago on what should have been a quiet Thursday afternoon at my farm just outside Roanoke, Virginia. Since my beloved wife Loretta passed away 2 years ago, that land had become my whole world, a refuge from the noise and clutter of modern life, somewhere I could work. The garden, tend the chickens, and sit out on the porch turning over the good decades Loretta and I had shared. I had willingly handed the tangled financial business over to my son-in-law Clifton. He was a sharp, fast-talking venture capitalist who had married my daughter Nadine 10 years ago. I trusted them. They were my blood, my family. That afternoon, I made my way down the long dirt driveway to the mailbox. Tucked in among the grocery store flyers and hardware catalogs was a thick envelope stamped in bright red urgent. It was from the county tax assessor. I ripped it open expecting some routine receipt. Instead, the bold black letters at the top of the page stopped the breath in my throat. Final notice of default. Property tax delinquency. Imminent foreclosure warning. I stood there on the driveway with the autumn wind cutting through me like something frozen. I read that document 3 times. It stated my property taxes were 90 days past due, and that if the balance wasn't cleared by month's end, the county would move to seize the farm. My farm. The home where Loretta and I had meant to live out our last years together. None of it made any sense. Exactly 1 month earlier, I had wired $35,000 directly into Clifton's account, money set aside specifically for those property taxes. He had reassured me over a family dinner that it was all handled, that a retired man had no business troubling himself with paperwork and wire transfers. I pulled out my phone right there in the driveway and called Nadine. My hands weren't shaking from age, they were shaking from a cold spike of dread. She picked up on the 4th ring, her voice wrapped in the ambient noise of some busy upscale restaurant. "Hello, Dad. I'm in the middle of a lunch meeting. Can I call you back?" Nadine, I need to understand why I just got a foreclosure warning from the county tax assessor. I said, holding my voice as steady as I could. I handed Clifton the money for those taxes 4 weeks ago. What is happening? Was tied, and it. A long pause settled on the line. The restaurant noise seemed to pull back. "Dad, calm down," she said, coating her words in that patronizing sweetness people use on frightened children. "Clifton took care of that. You probably received a delayed automated letter. Don't worry about it. We'll come by tonight and sort everything out. Just rest." They arrived just after sunset. The headlights of Clifton's sleek silver luxury sedan swept across the front porch where I sat waiting. Clifton climbed out first, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, looking entirely unbothered. Nadine followed, a designer handbag on her arm, her face wearing the expression of someone summoned for a tiresome errand. I brought them into the living room and laid the default notice flat on the coffee table. "Explain this to me, Clifton," I said, pressing a finger to the bold red ink. Clifton didn't touch the paper. He sighed, unbuttoned his jacket, and settled back against my sofa with a loose, arrogant ease. "Gordon, you are getting worked up over nothing," he said smoothly. "I paid those taxes weeks ago. The county office is notoriously slow updating their records. You know how government bureaucracies operate. But this letter was printed 3 days ago," I said, tapping the date at the top of the page. "It states explicitly that no payment has been received. If you paid it, show me the bank confirmation right now." Clifton and Nadine traded a quick, exasperated glance, the kind that screamed, "Here we go again," with the confused old man. Dad stopped interrogating him. Nadine stepped forward, resting a perfectly manicured hand on Clifton's shoulder. "He's doing you a favor managing your accounts. You've been forgetting everything lately. You are confused." "I am not confused, Nadine. I am reading a legal document." "You are confused, Dad," she pressed, lifting her voice just enough to fill the room, her eyes locked onto mine, cold and immovable. "Do you have any idea how much your memory has slipped? Last week you forgot the name of my new dog. 2 days ago, you called me to ask what day it was. And yesterday," she paused, drawing a trembling breath for effect. "Yesterday we stopped by while you were napping, and the gas stove had been left on. The whole kitchen reeked of it. You could have blown up the house and died, Dad. We had to shut it off and open every window. The room went utterly still. The only sound was the steady ticking of the mantel clock in the hallway. I stared at my daughter and felt the floor beneath my boots turn to ash. The gas stove. For just a fraction of a second, my mind betrayed me. I could almost conjure the smell. I thought of that kitchen, the warmth of it. Loretta used to stand at that very stove humming to old country records while she simmered her famous Sunday beef stews. The scent of garlic and rosemary used to drift through every room, making this house feel lived in and loved. But when Loretta lost her fight 2 years ago, the music stopped. The cooking stopped. I looked toward the kitchen archway. I had not switched on that gas stove in exactly 2 years. I'd been living on cold sandwiches, microwave meals, and coffee from an electric maker. I had shut off the main gas valve behind the appliance months back. I had no use for it. It was a physical impossibility that I had left the stove running the day before. A cold, clarifying dread settled over me. I was not losing my mind. My daughter was standing in my living room and lying directly to my face. But why? Why would she invent a story about me nearly destroying the house? Why was Clifton so utterly composed about $35,000 that had simply vanished? I studied their faces again. Nadine was delivering the performance of a devoted, exhausted daughter without a single false note. Clifton was playing the patient, wrongly accused son-in-law. If I had been nothing more than a grieving old farmer, I would have crumbled right there. I would have apologized for my failing memory and handed over what remained of my independence. But they had overlooked one essential fact about who I was. Before this farm, before the chickens and the garden and the quiet, I had spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor. I had looked straight into the eyes of the most ruthless, calculating white-collar criminals on the eastern seaboard. I knew exactly what a lie looked like. I could read the micro-expressions of a sociopath caught mid-deception. Those were the exact same expressions staring back at me now from my own family. Every instinct I had screamed at me to throw them out, to demand the money, return to drag the truth into the open. But the old prosecutor in me took over, cold and methodical. If I confronted them without solid evidence, they would double down. They'd use my anger as more proof of my supposed deterioration. To win this, I had to play inside their game. I had to let them believe the battle was already theirs. I let my shoulders drop. I let my hands tremble a little more than they needed to. I dropped my gaze to the floor, shaping myself into the picture of a beaten, disoriented old man. I left the stove on," I murmured, letting a manufactured crack into my voice. "Yes, Dad," Nadine said, her tone melting at once into that false syrupy warmth. "It terrified us. You're getting older. The grief is catching up with you. You cannot carry all this stress anymore." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes down, so she couldn't see the fury burning clean and hard behind them. "You might be right," I whispered. I'm just so tired." Clifton rose, buttoning his jacket with a satisfied smirk. "Don't give the tax notice another thought, Gordon. I'll phone the county assessor Monday morning and get their clerical error straightened out. You just focus on resting. We'll handle everything." They walked out the front door and left me alone in the quiet farmhouse. I stood at the window and watched Clifton's car dissolve into the dark. The sadness I'd been wearing drained away, replaced by something harder and colder underneath. They believed I was a helpless old man biding his time until the end. They thought they could rob me and gaslight me all the way into an institution, but they had just roused the wrong man from his sleep. The hunt had begun. The very next morning, before sunlight had cleared the tree line, Nadine was back at the farm. She walked into my kitchen holding a small unmarked amber prescription bottle, set it on the granite counter beside my coffee maker, and arranged her face into that soft, patronizing smile. "Dad, I spoke with Dr. Okafor this morning," she said, and poured me a cup of coffee. "He agrees with Clifton and me. The grief, the isolation, it's wearing on your cognitive functions. He prescribed these vitamins to support your memory and keep you sharp." I stood there staring at the little amber bottle. It looked harmless enough, just a plastic cylinder packed with small white capsules. But a voice deep in the back of my skull, an old and deeply cynical voice that had broken embezzlers and mob bosses on the witness stand, murmured quietly, "Don't touch them." I knew better than to dismiss that instinct. It had carried me through decades of courtroom battles without failing me once. But this was my daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I'd sent off to college bursting with pride, the woman I'd walked down the aisle to marry Clifton. How could I let my paranoid prosecutor's mind turn against my own flesh and blood over a forgotten gas burner? I told myself the foreclosure notice had rattled me, made me suspicious of shadows. I needed to trust my family, so I unscrewed the cap, shook out a capsule, and washed it down with my coffee. Nadine beamed, pressed a kiss to my cheek, and headed back to the city. She told me she'd send a text each morning to make sure I took my medicine, and for the sake of keeping the peace, I complied without argument. Within exactly 2 weeks, my entire physical world had begun curdling into a waking nightmare. It began as a subtle weight behind my eyes, a dense, persistent fog that settled over my thoughts by mid-morning. I had always risen easily at 5 to tend the vegetable garden and work through the financial papers. By the end of the first week on those pills, I could barely haul myself out of bed before 10:00. My legs felt packed with wet sand. Every step demanded a conscious effort. I would sit hunched on the edge of the mattress, pulling in air like a man going under. Then the tremors arrived. I noticed them first when I tried to sign a delivery receipt for some chicken feed. My hand shook so badly the pen skidded from my fingers and rattled across the porch boards. The delivery driver looked at me with that hollow, uncomfortable pity, the kind reserved for something beyond help. It turned my stomach. By the second week, the fog had thickened into something solid. Thoughts would crystallize in my mind, sharp and complete, then dissolve into static before I could give them voice. I found myself fixed on the living room wall for hours at a stretch, unable to account for how the time had gone. The legal mind that had spent 30 years outmaneuvering the most devious criminals in the country was being ground down to nothing. I felt like a man sealed inside a body that was quietly shutting down on him. Every memory of Loretta, every thread of our life together felt impossibly remote. But through the weight dragging me under, one thought kept breaking the surface: the tax default notice. Clifton had promised he'd contact the county and straighten it out. He had sworn my $35,000 was right where it belonged. But the suspicion had already taken root. I needed certainty. I needed to pull up my bank statements and trace that wire transfer myself. One afternoon, with the farmhouse quiet around me, I sat down at the kitchen table and drew the laptop toward me. My fingers hovered above the keys, trembling without stop. I tried to type my bank's web address, but my vision swam and the letters blurred together on the screen. 3 attempts just to reach the login portal. The bright display glared at me, indifferent to my struggle. I wiped the sweat from my forehead. I clicked into the username field. I typed it out, then moved to the password box. The cursor blinked. My mind emptied. I pressed my eyes shut and kneaded my temples, willing my brain to cooperate. I had used the same password on this account for 5 years. It was built from Loretta's maiden name and our anniversary year, a sequence that should have been carved into me permanently. But when I reached for it, there was nothing. Just white noise where the memory should have been. Fear began rising in my chest. My breathing grew short and ragged. I typed in what I believed the password to be: incorrect. I tried a variation, wondering if I'd capitalized the wrong letter. Incorrect. My hands shook so violently I was striking the wrong keys entirely. I hit enter a 3rd time. A red warning box bloomed across the screen. Your account has been temporarily locked due to multiple failed login attempts. Please contact customer service. I pushed the laptop aside, my pulse hammering. I snatched my cell phone from the table, thumbs fumbling across the screen to find the bank's customer service line. The automated voice asked me to enter my account number. I fished my debit card from my wallet and punched in all 16 digits. Then came the next prompt. Please enter your 4-digit telephone security PIN to speak with a representative. I went rigid. The phone against my ear felt like a slab of cold metal. 4 digits. 4 numbers. I had known this PIN the way I knew my own name, but standing in my kitchen staring at the wall, I could not pull a single digit from the silence. Whatever those drugs were doing to me had thrown up a wall between my mind and everything I'd stored behind it. Please enter your 4-digit telephone security PIN, the voice repeated. Come on, Gordon, I muttered under my breath. Think. Just think. I pressed in a sequence the year I was sworn in as a federal prosecutor. I waited, barely breathing. I'm sorry, that PIN is incorrect. You have 2 attempts remaining. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The room tilted slightly at the edges. The morning pill's lethargy was pulling at my legs, coaxing me back to bed and away from all of it. But the terror of losing my grip on things kept me rooted to the floor. I entered another set of numbers, Loretta's birth month and day. I'm sorry, that PIN is incorrect. You have 1 attempt remaining before your account is frozen for your protection. I lowered the phone from my ear. My chest lurched as I fought to draw a breath. I looked down at my hands. They were the hands of a broken old man, nothing like the hands that had once driven legal briefs onto mahogany tables and demanded justice. They looked hollow. I felt hollow. I ended the call and let the phone drop onto the table. The silence of the farmhouse collapsed around me, thick and suffocating. I sank into the nearest chair and buried my face in my trembling hands. For the first time since Loretta died, I was genuinely terrified. I was cut off from my own finances. I had no way to verify whether Clifton had taken my $35,000. I had no way to confirm the foreclosure notice was real. And worst of all, I was losing the only thing left that I could fight with my own mind. Nadine and Clifton had looked me in the eyes and told me these pills would help me think clearly. They had promised me that. But sitting there shaking, unable to recall 4 numbers I'd known by heart for years, a cold certainty cut through the haze. They were not trying to heal me. They were trying to erase me. The days that followed moved in a blur of grinding lucidity shot through with chemical exhaustion. I knew the capsules were poison, but I also understood that if I stopped abruptly, Nadine and Clifton would know I'd seen through them. The performance had to continue. I kept taking the pills when Nadine was watching, then palmed them and slipped them into my pocket. But enough of whatever was in them had already built up in my blood to keep my hands unsteady and my thoughts wading through mud. They came by again on a Sunday morning, bringing an expensive box of pastries from somewhere downtown. Nadine swept through the front door with her usual manufactured warmth, making a show of asking how her favorite father was getting along. Clifton followed behind her eyes on his watch, giving off the air of a man tolerating an obligation. I was at the kitchen counter working to pour a cup of black coffee. The heavy porcelain mug felt like it weighed 50 pounds. "Here, let me help you with that, Dad," Nadine said, gliding forward with a portrait of concern arranged carefully on her face. "I can do it," I muttered, leaning into the frailty I was performing. I closed both hands around the mug and lifted it. The shaking took over immediately. Dark coffee sloshed over the rim and scalded my knuckles. I tried to hold steady, but the tremors wouldn't allow it. The mug slipped, hit the hardwood floor, and exploded, sending hot liquid and jagged shards scattering across the room. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Clifton muttered, stepping heavily inside. "I'm sorry," I whispered at once, dropping to my knees. I gathered the broken pieces blindly, letting my hands shake more than they needed to. I kept my head down, playing the part of the pitiful, ruined old farmer they were so eager to see. "Don't cut yourself, Dad," Nadine said, her voice wrapped in counterfeit sympathy. "Just leave it, I'll get the mop." She headed off toward the utility closet down the hall. I stayed on the floor, carefully collecting a sharp ceramic shard. From where I crouched, I had a direct line of sight to the large sliding glass door that opened onto the back patio. The morning sun was striking the glass at precisely the right angle, turning it into a dark, flawless mirror. I watched the reflection. Clifton was standing behind me, leaning against the kitchen island. He wasn't looking down at me with any trace of pity or concern. His face wore a sneer of pure undisguised contempt, cold calculating impatience etched into every feature. Nadine came back into the kitchen with the mop. She stopped beside her husband and looked down at me as I fumbled with the shards. Clifton leaned close to her ear. His voice was barely a hiss, but the kitchen was quiet enough to carry every word straight to me. "He's practically useless now," Clifton whispered, eyes fixed on my trembling back. "It won't be long." Nadine did not correct him. She did not speak up for her father. She simply gave one short, silent nod and handed him a paper towel. As I stared at their reflection in the glass, something settled over my mind, a profound stillness. The chemical fog that had been smothering my thoughts burned away in a single flash of cold fury. The trembling in my hands ceased entirely. I stayed on that floor, clutching the broken shard, and let the weight of what he had just said press itself into my bones. "He's practically useless now." In that fraction of a second, the image of the feeble, confused, weak widower shattered completely. That look of arrogant contempt on Clifton's face had thrown a switch deep inside me, one I recognized. It was the exact same expression I used to see on Wall Street fraudsters right before I dismantled everything they'd built. 30 years ago, I sat across polished conference tables from men exactly like Clifton. Men who believed their smooth talk made them invulnerable. Men who thought they could manipulate the system, help themselves to whatever they wanted, and walk away without consequence. They always wore that smile right up until the moment I laid the evidence in front of a judge and watched the blood leave their faces. For 30 years, I was the apex predator in those courtrooms. I constructed cases so airtight that defense attorneys counseled their clients to plead guilty rather than face me. When Loretta died, I put all of that away. I traded tailored suits for flannel and legal briefs for garden tools. I wanted quiet. I wanted to heal. But watching Clifton stand in my kitchen, calmly plotting my ruin with my own daughter beside him, I understood that stepping away had been a mistake. I was not a sick old man. I was a target being hunted by amateurs. They believed they had found a soft mark, a grieving old man with a sizable bank account, and a memory giving way at the edges. They thought they could dose me into submission, strip me of my property, and warehouse me in some cheap facility to be forgotten. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I drew a slow, measured breath and felt the cold precision of my old career settle back over me, like something I had only set down for a moment. The prosecutor was fully awake, and he was hungry. I knew exactly what came next. I couldn't move against them yet, not without evidence. I needed a paper trail. I needed to build a case so airtight and so devastating that neither of them would ever recover from it. I let out a ragged, defeated sigh and allowed my hands to resume their shaking. I dropped the shard, pushed myself slowly off the floor, and leaned against the counter as though the effort had nearly finished me. "I'm so sorry, Nadine," I stammered, threading a tremor through my voice. "I just can't seem to hold on to anything today. My hands won't cooperate." Nadine patted my arm, her manufactured smile sliding back into place. "It's okay, Dad. That's why we're here to take care of you. Go sit in your recliner and rest. I'll clean this up." I nodded without argument and shuffled toward the living room, dragging my feet the way a heavily medicated man would. I eased myself into the old leather armchair and closed my eyes as though the short walk had drained me. In truth, my mind was running at full speed. Every detail of the room, every word they had said, every financial transaction I could recall was being sorted and filed. I listened to Nadine mopping the kitchen floor, to Clifton's fingers tapping against his phone. They were settled into their deception. They were certain the hardest part of their plan was behind them. They had no idea the real game had only just started. The following morning, the routine unfolded the same as it had for the past 2 weeks. Nadine called at 8 to confirm I was up, and to remind me to take my medicine. I kept my voice weak and rough around the edges, telling her the bottle was already in my hand. I unscrewed the cap, shook out one of the small white capsules, and carried it into the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot and my skin carried a pale, hollow cast. I dropped the pill into the toilet and flushed it. I watched the water spiral it out of sight, and along with it went the last remnant of blind trust I had ever placed in my daughter. Over the next 48 hours, I repeated the same ritual. Morning and evening, every pill went down the drain. The withdrawal was brutal. Deep muscle cramps tore through my body, and relentless headaches drove behind my temples as the chemical residue cleared out of me. But by the third morning, the heavy curtain lifted. My thoughts sharpened and snapped back into focus. The cognitive murk dissolved, and the calculating mind of a federal prosecutor came roaring back. My hands were steady as I poured my black coffee. I was back. But Nadine and Clifton could not know that. Whenever they called or visited, I kept the act running, letting my hands shake, letting my sentences drift off into uncertain silence. I needed proof of what was in those capsules. I knew better than to go to my regular physician in Roanoke. Nadine was listed as my emergency contact and held medical proxy rights on my file there. Any toxicology request made locally would send a notification directly to her phone. I had to stay off the grid entirely. I bypassed my sedan, which carried a GPS tracker, and walked out to the barn. Under a tarp sat my battered farm pickup from the 80s. I grabbed the keys, set the amber pill bottle on the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. The engine coughed and grumbled to life. I drove 50 miles on unpaved back roads until I reached a rural clinic sitting between two farm towns. The waiting room was empty. I approached the front desk and paid $300 in cash for a confidential consultation. Registering under a variation of my middle name, the attending physician was a gray-haired, tired-looking man who seemed genuinely surprised to have an elderly walk-in requesting a toxicology panel. I sat on the examination table, handed him one of the white capsules and a $50 bill for an expedited result, and told him I needed to know exactly what compounds were inside it, along with a blood panel to identify what was still circulating in my system. He turned the capsule over in his gloved hands with a slight frown, but the cash and the firmness in my voice left him no room to push back. He assured me the results would be ready by the following afternoon. I thanked him, walked back out to the pickup, and started the drive home. The adrenaline of the errand kept my thoughts moving fast. I was mapping my next legal moves, working out how to unravel Clifton's financial scheming as the country roads rolled past me. I turned the full reality of my situation over in my mind. My entire professional life had been spent putting people like this behind bars, analyzing financial fraud, dissecting testimony, shielding vulnerable people from precisely the kind of predatory behavior my own family was now running on me. The brazenness of it was staggering. They had assumed that because I was a grieving widower, I had forgotten how to fight. They had mistaken my age for vulnerability. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and felt the clarity settle over me like cold water. I wasn't simply going to stop them. I was going to dismantle everything they had built, piece by piece, and leave them with nothing. I'd been so deep in my planning that I'd lost track of the time entirely. I glanced at the dashboard clock. Nearly noon. Nadine always rang the kitchen landline at noon during her lunch break to check on my condition. If I didn't pick up, she'd panic. If she panicked, she'd send Clifton out to the farm to investigate, and they'd realize I was lucid capable and already running an operation right behind their backs. I pressed my boot hard onto the gas. The truck shuddered as I pushed it past the limit, hammering down the rural highway. Pine trees streaked past the windows in a blur. My knuckles went white on the steering wheel. I ran the numbers, distance versus time. It was going to be tight. I swung hard onto the dirt driveway tires, throwing up a wall of dust. Before the truck had even rolled to a stop behind the barn, I could already hear it, the landline ringing, carrying clean and clear from the kitchen window. I killed the engine, shoved the door open, and ran. The phone rang again. Fifth ring, one more, and she'd hang up and assume the worst. I ripped open the screen door, crossed the kitchen floor in 3 strides, and tore the receiver from the wall mount just as the 6th ring started. I pressed it to my chest for 1 second. I slowed my breathing, steadied myself, then I brought it to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling and hoarse. "Dad!" Nadine's voice came through sharp and tight. "I was about to call Clifton and have him drive out there. Is everything all right?" "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I mumbled, pushing a weak chuckle into my voice. I was out on the porch. Took me a minute to remember where the ringing was coming from. My legs are so heavy today. The medicine is making me sleepy, I think. She let out a slow breath. The edge in her voice dissolved, replaced once more by that practiced sugary warmth. "Oh, Dad, you need to be careful. Don't push yourself. The vitamins are doing their job helping your brain heal. Did you take your morning dose?" I glanced at the empty amber bottle sitting in my pocket. "Yes, Nadine." I whispered, my eyes fixed on the kitchen wall. "I took it exactly like you told me to. I'm following all your instructions." "Good," she said. "Clifton and I will come by this weekend to check on things. Just stay in the house, Dad. We'll handle everything from here." I set the receiver down slowly and let the mask fall away. I stood straight in the middle of that quiet kitchen, my breathing, even my mind, sharp and entirely my own again. The trap was laid. The greedy hunters had no idea they were walking straight into a cage. The phone rang again just past 2 the following afternoon. I let it go 3 times before lifting the receiver, making sure my breathing was unhurried and steady. It was the doctor from the rural clinic, right on schedule. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice carried a professional gravity that put me on alert immediately. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I was on my feet, but that my head was completely clear. He said what he'd found was deeply disturbing. The pills Nadine had been giving me were not vitamins. They contained no trace of any dietary supplement whatsoever. They were a concentrated generic formulation of a potent antipsychotic medication, a drug reserved for the most severe cases of acute schizophrenia and violent psychotic episodes. The dosage in those capsules was dangerously elevated, particularly for a man my age. He explained that introducing heavy neuroleptics into a healthy brain would rapidly manufacture the appearance of advanced dementia. It shuts down the nervous system. It produces artificial tremors, profound disorientation, blocked memory retrieval, and a crushing exhaustion that traps the patient inside a body that appears to be failing. He warned me that continued exposure risked permanent neurological damage or a fatal cardiac event. He urged me to contact the authorities without delay and offered to transmit his lab results directly to the local police. I thanked him for his care, declined his offer to involve law enforcement just yet, and asked him to mail a certified hard copy of the lab report to a private post office box I kept under a different name. I hung up. The silence in the kitchen pressed down like something physical. My own daughter had poisoned me. She had smiled at me, kissed my cheek, and placed the very chemical chains meant to drag me into a care facility right into my hands. The betrayal was so total, so deliberately evil, that it moved beyond anything I recognized as ordinary anger. It hardened into something colder and more durable, pure tactical resolve. I knew Nadine was occupied with a corporate media launch that afternoon, which meant Clifton would be the one making the daily welfare check. He arrived just before 5:00. The gravel crackled under the weight of his sleek silver luxury sedan. I watched from the kitchen window. He climbed out and straightened his expensive cashmere overcoat, scanning my property with the eyes of someone calculating what it might fetch on the open market. He came up the porch steps without knocking and walked in on the spare key I'd foolishly handed over years ago. I shuffled quickly into the living room, dropped my shoulders, and let a visible tremor reclaim my hands. I fixed my gaze on the cold fireplace, jaw slack, playing the sedated and hollowed-out father without a flaw. Clifton entered the room and stopped a few feet from my chair. No inquiry about how I was feeling, no warm word of greeting. He simply stood there drawing a slim leather planner from his breast pocket and writing something down. "Gordon," he said, his voice raised and condescending. "Did you take your afternoon dose? Nadine said you sounded a bit off on the phone yesterday. We need to make sure you're keeping up with your regimen." I turned my head toward him, slowly blinking as though struggling to bring him into focus. "Yes," I murmured, letting my voice break. "I took them. But my head feels so heavy today, Clifton. Everything's spinning." He exhaled a short, dismissive sound that made plain how little my existence registered with him. "Well, the doctor said it takes time for your brain chemistry to balance out. You need to sit quietly and let the medication work." As he spoke, his ringing phone pulled his hand into the right pocket of his overcoat. When he drew it out, the coat fabric shifted just enough to catch the afternoon light on something metallic. A small, distinctively shaped brass key on a heavy silver ring. I knew it in an instant. It was the master key to the heavy floor safe tucked behind the false paneling in my study. A month earlier, when I'd first noticed it gone from my nightstand, Nadine had spent the better part of an hour helping me comb through the house for it. She'd taken my hands in hers, looked me squarely in the eyes, and told me gently that my memory was slipping, that I must have misplaced it during one of my confused spells. She had used my own missing property as the first stone in her edifice of lies, and that key had been sitting in her husband's pocket the entire time. I needed it back. If they were getting into my safe, they had access to the original deeds, the bearer bonds, and the entire legal architecture of my estates. I had to recover it right then, but I couldn't demand it outright. The moment I confronted him, the act was finished. I had to take it. Back in the late 80s, I had led a sweeping federal takedown of a large organized crime syndicate operating out of the eastern seaboard, To build that case, I'd relied heavily on a street-level informant named Ralphie, a gifted pickpocket who had turned state's evidence. During the long hours we spent together in the safe house, Ralphie had walked me through the mechanics of the dip. He said successful theft had nothing to do with speed. It was about misdirection. You create a sudden, overwhelming point of physical contact, a shock that floods the target's senses and makes them completely blind to what your hands are actually doing. Never in all my years did I imagine I'd reach into a mobster's playbook and use it against my own son-in-law right there in my living room. I gripped the armrests and began pushing myself up from the chair, letting my legs tremble and buckle beneath me. "Clifton, I need water," I wheezed. He rolled his eyes and stepped toward me. "Just sit down, Gordon. I'll get it from the kitchen." As he reached to press me back into the seat, I made my move. I let my eyes go glassy and roll back. I drained every ounce of tension from my body, dropping into a dead, boneless faint. My full weight pitched forward straight into Clifton. He grunted, startled, his phone tumbling from his grip onto the carpet as his arms shot out on instinct and wrapped around my torso. Both hands clamped onto my shoulders, every bit of his attention swallowed up by the sudden burden of my collapsing frame. He was completely overwhelmed by the shock of it. In that precise instant, while his mind was entirely consumed with keeping us both upright, my right hand glided quietly into the open pocket of his cashmere overcoat. My fingers found the cold metal of the brass key. I pinched it between my index and middle finger and drew it out in one smooth, practiced motion, tucking it immediately into the waistband of my trousers and pulling my sweater down over it. The whole extraction was done in under 2 seconds. "What is wrong with you?" He snapped, straining to haul my heavy frame back into the leather armchair. "Get up, Gordon. Come on, sit back down." I let him work me back into the seat. I sagged against the cushions and let out a long, ragged breath, blinking, as if the world had just swum back into focus. "I'm sorry." I breathed barely above a whisper. The room just went completely black. I felt so dizzy. Clifton brushed off his expensive cashmere overcoat with a look of pure revulsion. He crouched to retrieve his phone from the floor, entirely unaware that his pocket was now one item lighter. "This is exactly why you can't be left on your own anymore," he muttered, tapping out a quick message on the screen. "You are becoming a massive liability. I'll get you a glass of tap water, and then I have to go. I have a business meeting." He turned his back and headed for the kitchen. The moment he cleared the doorway, I reached into my waistband and pulled out the brass key. It sat heavy and cold in my palm. I closed my fingers around it, feeling the sharp edges bite into my skin. It wasn't merely a piece of metal. It was the key to my survival. It was proof that they were already inside my vault, quietly tearing my life apart from within. Clifton came back and shoved a glass of water onto the side table. "Drink that and stay in that chair," he said. "Nadine will call you tonight." I nodded, slowly, hands folded in my lap, concealing what I'd taken. "Thank you, Clifton," I murmured. "You are a good son." He sneered, spun on his heel, and walked out the front door. I listened to his sleek silver luxury sedan fire up and roll down the gravel drive. I didn't move a muscle until the engine faded completely into the distance. Then I sat up straight. The trembling stopped. The weakness fell away like a coat I'd shrugged off. I looked down at the brass key lying in my open palm. The rage that had been building quietly in my chest hardened into something clear and cold and purposeful. They had poisoned my body. They had treated my mind like a thing to be managed. Now they were plundering my vault. The time for endurance was finished. It was time to fight back. Every piece of evidence I collected from here on out would be another nail driven into their coffins. I wasn't going to merely survive what they had set in motion against me. I was going to tear down their fraudulent world just as ruthlessly as they had tried to erase mine. I waited until the sun dropped below the tree line, and the farm outside Roanoke was wrapped in full darkness. I knew better than to touch the landline or my regular cell. If Clifton and Nadine were brazen enough to drug me and steal the key to my safe, they were more than capable of pulling my call logs. During my afternoon stop at the rural clinic, I had bought a cheap prepaid phone with cash. I drew the small device from my boot, powered it on, and dialed a number I'd carried in my head for more than 20 years. It rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice picked up. It was Leonard Farrell. Leonard was a titan in the world of civil law, a man who moved through courtrooms with a surgeon's precision and a shark's cold patience. We had squared off on opposite sides more than once during my years as a federal prosecutor. Over time, that professional rivalry had settled into a deep, unspoken mutual respect. He was the only person on earth I would trust with something this heavy. "Leonard," I said, keeping my voice low. "It's Gordon Whitfield. I'm on an unregistered phone. Don't call back on my regular number." There was a brief pause. "Gordon." Leonard answered, his tone shifting instantly from easy to all business. "You don't buy burner phones to talk about the weather. What's going on?" I laid out the facts with the cold detachment of a man presenting an indictment. I told him about the property tax default notice. I told him about the antipsychotic drugs my own daughter had been passing off as vitamins. I told him about Clifton taking the key to my hidden floor safe. I offered no emotional commentary. I gave him only the evidence. I reminded him that if this effort failed, I stood to lose everything: my land, my legacy, my freedom. He swore to me he would move heaven and earth to stop that from happening. Leonard was quiet for a long stretch after I finished. When he spoke again, his voice carried a low, quiet fury. "They are setting you up for a fraudulent conservatorship, Gordon. They want to establish your medical incompetence on paper so they can seize your assets. We need to document their actions right now. I need eyes inside my own house," I told him. "I need them to catch Clifton opening that safe. But it has to be completely off the books. No registered security firms, no paper trail they can stumble onto." "I have a private technical team," Leonard told me. "Former federal surveillance professionals who work exclusively for my firm. Discreet and fast. I'll send them to your farm tonight. Leave the back door unlocked." The hours before midnight moved with agonizing slowness. I sat in the darkened living room and watched pale moonlight press through the curtains. I ran through every legal angle in my head, turning each one over, testing it. I was no longer a father trying to make sense of his child. I was an investigator laying a trap. At exactly midnight, 2 unmarked dark sedans rolled silently up my dirt driveway. Headlights dark. 3 men dressed in plain, dark clothing slipped out and moved quickly toward the back porch. They wore gloves and carried gear bags that looked unremarkable from the outside. I opened the heavy wooden door and let them in. They asked no questions and offered no small talk. They simply went to work with a quiet, assured professionalism that settled something in my chest. The lead technician, a tall man with sharp, watchful eyes, handed me a secure tablet and explained that they would be placing military-grade micro cameras directly into the architectural molding of the living room and the study. The lenses were no larger than a pinhead invisible to the naked eye. The video feeds would be encrypted and routed straight to a protected server at Leonard's law firm. If Clifton or Nadine set foot in this house, every movement and every word would be captured and preserved as irrefutable legal evidence. I directed them to the study first. I pointed to the heavy oak bookshelves running along the far wall. The floor safe was concealed beneath a false section of hardwood, directly under the bottom shelf. The technicians nodded and began drilling microscopic holes into the crown molding near the ceiling. They routed hairline wires back behind the drywall, working with surgical precision. I watched from the low light of a desk lamp, feeling a strange blend of relief and deep aching sorrow. I was converting my own sanctuary into an active surveillance operation to catch my daughter committing a felony. The weight of that truth pressed hard against my chest, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was a war of survival. Every second ticked loudly in my ears, a reminder that we were working inside a narrow, dangerous window. If Clifton had chosen to swing by for another unannounced check, the entire operation would have unraveled on the spot. The installation, however, turned out to be far more involved than anyone had counted on. The century-old plaster and dense oak beams of the farmhouse fought back against their modern tools. What was meant to be a quick 45-minute job stretched into 90 minutes. The study was done. They were moving out into the main living room now to set up a secondary camera angle. The lead technician signaled that they needed another 30 minutes to hide the power transmitter behind the fireplace mantel. I stood watch at the front window, eyes fixed on the long, dark stretch of road cutting toward my property. It was exactly 1:45 in the morning when the silent alarm went off. A small blue light pulsed on the digital monitor I kept beside the front door. That monitor was tied to a motion sensor I'd put in at the mouth of my driveway years back to catch delivery trucks. Someone had just turned onto my land. A cold knot tightened in my gut. My breathing went shallow as the full weight of what was happening settled over me. The entire operation was suspended on a thread no thicker than a hair. The tech team had live wiring stretched across the center of the living room floor. The heavy mantelpiece was partly pulled away from the wall. Tools lay scattered over the antique braided wool rug. I pressed the button on the monitor to bring up the gate camera feed. A sleek black luxury SUV was edging up the driveway, crawling slow enough to keep the gravel quiet. The license plate left no doubt. It was Nadine. She had come to check on me. My mind worked fast, turning over her motive. Why would she make that drive all the way out here at nearly 2 in the morning? The answer struck me like a fist. The evening dose. I had flushed my nighttime pill hours ago, but I had never sent her a text confirming I'd taken it. I had been so locked in on coordinating with Leonard and the surveillance team that I had let the illusion of compliance slip. Nadine, fixated on keeping my system saturated with those antipsychotic drugs, had driven out to the farm in the dead of night to put the pill down my throat herself. I already knew she was ruthless, but making that drive at 2:00 in the morning told me exactly how deeply committed she was to this whole dark scheme. The stakes were life and death, plain and simple. I spun to face the technicians. "Vehicle coming up the drive," I whispered sharp and low. "You have 2 minutes before she's at the front door." All 3 men moved without hesitation. They began coiling the exposed wires and pushing equipment into their black duffel bags. But the living room was a wreck. A pale coat of plaster dust from the drilling lay plainly visible against the dark, polished hardwood. The mantelpiece still sat slightly out of true. There was no possible way they could pack up, clean the evidence, and clear the house before Nadine saw the disruption. The bright sweep of her SUV headlights crossed the front windows, throwing long, jagged shadows up the living room walls. I could hear the crunch of tires as she rolled to a stop directly behind the tech team's unmarked sedans. She would see those cars. She would see the dust. She would understand that a trap was being built and the entire case would collapse before I had filed so much as a single document. I had to buy them time. I needed a distraction so large, so alarming, that it would wipe the strange cars and the dust from her mind entirely and fix every bit of her attention on me. I looked at the lead technician. "Out the back window," I said quietly. "Don't stop moving until you hit the tree line. I'll deal with her and give you the minutes you need." The heavy thud of a car door rang out through the cold night air. Her expensive heels began clicking against the stone walkway up to the porch, steady and deliberate. I had maybe 10 seconds. I had to become the broken, helpless old man she was convinced she had made, and I had to do it right there on the porch before she ever reached for the door handle. I threw open the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the night. The freezing air hit my bare skin like a wall. I had nothing on but thin cotton pajamas, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. The cold was immediate and brutal, but I welcomed it. It made every physical reaction real. I let the shivering take hold, teeth rattling together as I lurched down the wooden steps and onto the frozen gravel. I crossed my arms over my chest shoulders, curling inward, and began drifting in an aimless, wandering path toward the blinding glare of her headlights. I stretched my eyes wide, pushing a look of total hollow terror onto my face. My jaw went loose. I needed to look like a man whose mind had come completely unmoored, a man stumbling through the wreckage of his own memory, frightened of the dark lost inside his own home. Nadine cut the engine and slammed her door. I heard the sharp bite of her boots on the gravel as she came toward me. Even in the darkness, I could feel the fury in the way she carried herself. "What on earth are you doing out here, Gordon?" she snapped. "Not Dad, just Gordon the word, cold and clipped." Her voice had no warmth in it, only irritation. "Get back inside this instant. Are you trying to catch pneumonia?" I didn't look at her. I looked past her shoulder into the black tree line, one trembling hand rising to point at nothing. "Loretta," I wailed, letting my voice splinter with desperate, pitiful longing. "Loretta, is that you? Where have you been? I've been looking everywhere. I can't find the keys, Loretta. The house is so cold." Nadine stopped where she stood. The sheer depth of my apparent unraveling caught her completely off guard. She stared at me, shivering in the frost, barefoot on the jagged stones, crying out for a woman years in the ground. I stumbled forward, arms reaching out, grasping at the empty air. I could practically watch the calculation shift behind her eyes. The irritation gave way to something uglier, a twisted, triumphant satisfaction. She actually believed her poison pills had finally tipped me over the edge into full dementia. She stepped in and took hold of my arm at the bicep. Her grip was harder than I expected, fingernails pressing through the thin cotton into my skin. "Stop this nonsense," she said, pulling me toward the porch. "Loretta is dead. You're confused. Move your feet." I resisted. I planted my bare feet in the frozen gravel and let every muscle go slack, throwing my full weight against her. No, no! I pleaded, shaking my head in wild, frantic loops. I have to wait for her. She was coming right back. Don't make me go inside. It's not safe in there. The shadows are moving. I'm frightened. I dragged out every second of the struggle, pulling against her grip, stumbling over the stones, doing everything in my power to keep us both out in that freezing air. Every moment I stalled was another moment the surveillance team had to secure the gear, wipe away the plaster dust, and disappear into the woods. Nadine grunted in frustration, fighting to hold my heavy frame upright, digging her heels into the dirt and cursing under her breath. "Get up, you foolish old man!" she growled, the loving daughter act gone entirely. "You are going to ruin everything if you freeze to death out here in the yard." "Stand up!" I let my knees fold again, scraping my shins across the icy gravel. I moaned in manufactured agony, clutching at her expensive cashmere overcoat, with both hands like a terrified child reaching for safety. "Please," I sobbed, pressing my face against her sleeve. "They're watching me in there. The men in the walls are watching me. I can't go back inside." The irony of those words was mine alone to appreciate. To Nadine, it was just one more symptom of deep psychotic paranoia. She wrenched her arm away, repelled by my touch. "You are hallucinating, Gordon. There is no one in the walls. There is no one here but you and me. Now walk." I dragged my feet, forcing her to haul me step by grinding step up the wooden stairs. I counted silently in my head. 10 seconds, 20, 30. I needed to give Leonard's team every last moment of certainty. I let myself trip deliberately on the top step, going down hard onto the wooden deck of the porch, face forward, flat on my stomach. I lay there gasping, letting the bitter cold work its way into my bones. Nadine kicked my left leg, a sharp, mean motion that said everything words could never fully capture about the darkness living inside her. "I said get up," she hissed, dropping down so her face was close to mine. "You are not going to ruin my plans tonight. You are going to go inside. You are going to take your medication, and you are going to sleep." I pressed myself up onto my hands and knees, whimpering softly. Before I tell you what I discovered in those hours, and what it revealed about the people I had trusted most with everything I'd built, let me ask you this: if you slowly began to realize that someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you go silent and gather every piece of proof first? I let her grab the collar of my pajama shirt and drag me upright. We half stumbled through the front door and into the main hallway. The warmth of the house closed around me, but I kept on shivering. I slid down the wall, pulled my knees to my chest, and rocked. Nadine stood over me, breathing hard from the effort. She smoothed her expensive cashmere overcoat and fixed me with a stare of pure contempt. She didn't look toward the living room, not once. Every bit of her focus was locked on managing the pitiful wreck huddled at her feet. I stole a quick, careful glance down the hall. The living room sat in perfect darkness. The heavy power tools were gone. The rear door was pulled shut. The pale coating of plaster dust had been swept away in a hurry. Leonard's team had disappeared like smoke. "Stay right there," she said, spinning toward the kitchen. "Don't move a single muscle." I heard her open the glass cabinet and run the cold tap into a small plastic cup. She came back with water and a white capsule. "You missed your nighttime dose," she said, her voice flat and cold, crouching to my level. She pressed the pill against my lips. "Open your mouth and swallow this right now." I whimpered, but I opened my mouth obediently. I set the pill on my tongue, took a long pull of water, and swallowed with an exaggerated bob of my throat so she could see it go down. She watched me without blinking, holding her position for a full minute to be certain I hadn't tucked it away. What she didn't know was that I had already palmed the capsule inside my cheek. Satisfied, Nadine stood, gave me one last look of revulsion, and left. The moment her car pulled away, I spat the pill out. I looked up at the crown molding. A tiny red light blinked once. The cameras were live. The quiet hunt for their complete destruction had officially begun. The following morning arrived under a heavy gray overcast that matched the cold resolve settling into my bones. I sat alone at the kitchen island, a heavy porcelain mug of black coffee steaming untouched beside the encrypted tablet Leonard had given me. My hands were perfectly steady. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the mantel clock in the hallway. I powered on the tablet and worked through the sequence of passcodes Leonard had walked me through. The screen came alive, splitting into multiple high-definition grids. The clarity was remarkable. Every corner of the living room, every shadow in the study, all of it captured through lenses so small they were invisible to the naked eye. I picked up the burner phone and dialed Leonard. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and businesslike. "We have clean feeds," Leonard said. "No sign of interference. I have my forensic accounting team monitoring the stream from our dedicated server. We're waiting for your son-in-law to make his move." I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, gravel crunching beneath tires announced an arrival. I was sitting in my bedroom, having deliberately left the main rooms of the house empty. An hour earlier, I had texted Nadine claiming I felt too weak to move and was going to sleep off the medication. She had almost certainly passed that along to Clifton, handing him exactly the window he was looking for. I fixed my eyes on the tablet screen. The front door opened with a quiet click. Clifton stepped into the hallway. He moved with the careful, deliberate tread of a predator, placing his feet lightly on the old hardwood to keep the boards from creaking. At the foot of the staircase, he stopped and listened, satisfying himself that the heavy dose of antipsychotics had me unconscious upstairs. Then he turned and walked straight into the study. The camera set into the crown molding caught every detail of his face. There was no hesitation in how he moved. He knew exactly where he was going and what he had come for. I watched jaw tight as the man who had married my daughter came around my heavy mahogany desk. He dropped to one knee on the antique braided wool rug, rolled the heavy woven fabric back to bare the floorboards beneath, ran his fingers along the edge of the wood, found the hidden latch, and lifted the false panel. The heavy steel door of my floor safe came into view. He reached into his pocket and produced the brass key. The very key I had lifted from him, had copied at a local hardware store, and had quietly slipped back into his coat pocket during a feigned stumble the night before. He pushed the copied key into the lock, turned it hard, and swung the door open. A wave of sick-cold violation moved through me as I watched his hands reach into my vault. He drew out thick manila folders, original deeds to the farm property boundary. Documents bearer, bonds, full outlines of my financial portfolios. He fanned them across my desk like a man spreading out a hand of cards. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his jacket and turned on the camera. For the next 20 minutes, the high-definition feed recorded Clifton working through every single page with methodical patience. Account numbers, routing codes, signature baselines, legal descriptions of every asset I owned. He was building a complete digital replica of my entire estate. I watched him return the folders to the safe lock. The steel door replaced the false panel and roll the rug back to its exact original position. He left as quietly as he had come. When the screen finally showed nothing but an empty room, Leonard's voice came through the burner phone, heavier than I had ever heard it. "Gordon, we have a serious problem," he said, all professional distance stripped away. "I put my best forensic accountants on Clifton yesterday morning. I had them pull apart his venture capital firm public filings, the works, to find out exactly what his finances look like." "What did they find?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "It's a sham, Gordon. The whole firm is a hollow shell. He hasn't made a profitable investment in over 4 years. He's been burning through money running on credit and floating loans to prop up the image of a thriving corporate life. But it goes well beyond just being broke. He owes money a staggering amount." "How much?" I pressed. $15 million. Leonard said, the number settling in the air between us like something with weight. "And he doesn't owe it to any conventional bank. He owes it to a shadow banking syndicate operating out of Atlanta. These are not people who send collection notices. Gordon, these are violent, ruthless creditors who specialize in high-interest off-the-books lending to desperate executives. Clifton is completely cornered, and his time is almost gone." I stared at the dark tablet screen, the pieces locking together one by one. The fake vitamins, the isolation, the theft of the documents. "He's using my estate," I said aloud, the cold truth of it settling over me. "That is exactly right," Leonard confirmed. "He's putting your assets up as collateral to keep the syndicate at bay. He needed photographs of your deeds and portfolios to prove to these people that he can put his hands on real capital. We found newly registered holding companies in Nevada. He has already forged your signature on multiple loan guarantee documents. He is pledging the farm your investments, everything Loretta left behind to save his own life. If he defaults on this shadow debt, the syndicate won't stop at him. They'll come for the farm. They'll seize your property through fraudulent liens. And because he's building a paper trail of your mental incompetence, any court would simply assume you signed the assets away in a confused state. The sheer cold brilliance of their scheme left me momentarily without breath. Nadine and Clifton were not simply greedy children circling an inheritance. They were desperate criminals using my life as a human shield against a violent cartel. They were systematically destroying my mind with chemical restraints, so I would be incapable of fighting back when the syndicate arrived to take the farm. Every warm smile Nadine had ever offered me, every cup she had set in front of me, was a deliberate step towards surrendering my legacy to violent men. I looked around the kitchen and thought of Loretta. We had built this life, with our own hands poured everything we had into this land. The thought of losing it to an Atlanta crime syndicate because of my son-in-law's reckless greed ignited something inside me that burned hotter and deeper than anything I had felt across 30 years behind a prosecutor's desk. I sat at the kitchen island staring at the encrypted tablet while the reality of Leonard's words echoed through the silent room. $15 million. A shadow banking syndicate. My own daughter and her husband were perfectly willing to let violent criminals strip away my farm, my home, and everything I had built just to cover their own reckless debts. They were keeping me chemically sedated while they signed my life over to strangers. I closed the connection with Leonard and powered the tablet down. I knew I could bring the camera footage to law enforcement right now and have them both arrested for elder abuse, but that wasn't enough. If I moved too early, Clifton would claim he was simply organizing my papers for my own benefit. Nadine would weep in front of a judge playing the devoted daughter, struggling to care for a father in serious cognitive decline. They would hire high-priced defense lawyers and shape the whole thing into a narrative about a family tragedy born of love and confusion. I needed them to step across a line they could never come back from. I needed them to commit an act of fraud so naked and undeniable, it would be captured in full by those lenses hidden in the molding. I had to force their hand, and to do that, I needed to create a ticking clock. I had to put in danger the one thing they needed most to appease the Atlanta syndicate, the farm. I called Nadine. I deliberately kept my breathing shallow to make my voice sound fragile. When she picked up, her tone was clipped and impatient, the sound of a woman pulled away from something more important. I asked her to come to the house that afternoon. I told her I was having a rare clear day, a brief window where the haze had lifted, and that I needed to talk about something of serious consequence regarding the future of the estate. I could hear her pause, then the familiar calculated shift in her manner. She promised she'd be there by 4:00. I spent the next 2 hours staging everything carefully. I brewed a pot of coffee, poured it down the drain, and left the empty, heavy porcelain mug on the table. I roughed up my hair, left my flannel collar unbuttoned, and draped a wool blanket over my knees as I settled into the leather armchair in the living room. I positioned myself squarely within the best viewing angle of the micro camera Leonard's team had embedded in the crown molding. I was the bait sitting at the center of the trap. At 4:00, Nadine's vehicle rolled up the gravel drive. She came through the front door a moment later, carrying a plastic grocery bag stuffed with cheap soup cans, a pathetic prop meant to signal her supposed devotion. She dropped the bag on the counter and walked into the living room, stopping a few feet from my chair. She looked at me with a thin veneer of concern laid over visible irritation. "You said you were having a clear day, Dad." She noted eyes sweeping the room to make sure we were alone. "You sounded quite serious on the phone. What is going on?" I looked up at her, keeping my hands perfectly still to sell the illusion of temporary lucidity. I let my eyes fill with tears, drawing on the genuine grief her betrayal had placed in me. "Nadine." I began letting my voice break with manufactured sorrow. "I know what is happening to me. I know my mind is giving way. The fog comes in thicker every single day. Soon, I will not remember my own name, let alone the legacy we built on this land." I drew a slow, unsteady breath. She moved closer, her posture going rigid. She was clearly trying to calculate whether this was a genuine moment of clarity or another effect of the antipsychotics she had been feeding me. "Oh, Dad, do not speak like that," she murmured, reaching out to pat my shoulder with a hand that carried no warmth. "The vitamins are helping. You just need more time." "No, Nadine," I said, drawing back gently from her touch. "We both know the truth. I am losing this fight. But today, right now, my thinking is clear, and I have a real responsibility to protect this property before I am gone entirely. I cannot let this beautiful farm fall to ruin while I sit in a nursing home. I cannot leave you and Clifton burdened with the upkeep of an estate this size." She went completely still. Her hand hung suspended in the air between us. I watched the color slowly drain from her face, leaving it pale and drawn. "What are you saying, Dad?" she asked, her voice dropping to a tight, frightened whisper. I held her gaze and delivered the blow with careful precision. "I am saying that I called my estate lawyer this morning." I lied without flinching. I asked him to draft the final paperwork. This coming Monday at exactly 9 in the morning, I am signing the entire farm, the house, the fields, all the surrounding acreage over to the state agricultural charity. They will preserve the land in your mother's name in perpetuity. It is the only way to keep it safe from developers and tax liability. The estate will be gone, Nadine, but it will serve a purpose worth something. Nadine stared at me as if I had driven something sharp straight through her chest. Her breathing turned quick and shallow. The polished, patronizing mask she wore so flawlessly cracked apart before my eyes. She needed this property to placate the violent syndicate pressing down on her husband's neck. Without the farm as collateral, Clifton was finished and the life she had constructed around herself would come apart at every seam. "But Monday," she stammered, eyes wide with raw, unguarded panic. "Dad, you cannot do that. You are not thinking clearly. You cannot just give away the family inheritance on a whim. Clifton and I have plans for this place. You have to cancel that meeting." I shook my head slowly, letting a quiet, resigned smile settle on my face. "No, sweetheart," I whispered softly. "My mind is made up. The lawyer is filing the documents on Monday morning. Once my signature goes on that paper, the transfer is irrevocable. It will be done." She took 2 steps back as if the finality of it had physically pushed her. Her hands were shaking with the very tremors she had been trying to chemically manufacture in me. She snatched her purse from the sofa, unable to pull a coherent sentence together. "I have to go," she gasped, already turning toward the hall. "I will be right back." She was out the front door nearly at a run, slamming it hard behind her. I listened to the frantic roar of her engine as she tore down the driveway. The clock was ticking loudly now. I had given them exactly 48 hours before the estate disappeared. They could not afford to wait. They would have to move this weekend. The bait was taken, and the predators were charging headlong into my trap. Friday morning came in with a deceptive stillness. The heavy clouds of the previous days had broken apart, and a pale, thin wash of sunlight lay across the frost-covered pastures. I was up at 5 hours, my mind clearer than it had been in months. The last chemical traces of the antipsychotics had cleared from my bloodstream entirely. I sat at the kitchen table with a hot cup of black coffee and opened the encrypted tablet to go through the overnight surveillance footage. The trap was perfectly set. I had a final meeting scheduled with Leonard Farrell that afternoon to hand over the digital evidence, the toxicology reports, and the recorded footage of Clifton breaking into my safe. We were going to file a sweeping federal injunction, freezing every asset and triggering a criminal fraud investigation before the sun went down. I felt something deep and resonant settle inside me, a sense of vindication that reached into my bones. I had outmaneuvered them. I was the veteran prosecutor who had drawn arrogant amateurs into a legal ambush they would never see coming, but I had badly underestimated the raw, terrifying speed of a desperate man with nothing left to lose. At exactly 8:15, the stillness of the morning was shattered by the grinding crunch of heavy tires tearing up my gravel driveway. Not one vehicle, a convoy. I crossed to the kitchen window and pulled back the curtain. My blood ran cold. 3 county sheriff cruisers sat parked at hard angles across my front lawn, their light bars throwing blue and red against the morning frost. Behind them, a sterile white passenger van bearing the seal of the Department of Social Services blocked the main exit. Doors came open in unison. Uniformed deputies climbed out and adjusted their belts, moving with the coiled, deliberate tension of officers responding to something volatile. 2 people in plain clothes, a man and a woman, each holding a thick clipboard, stepped from the white van and fell in beside the officers. I stood frozen at the sink. My entire federal case, every piece of my meticulously assembled counterattack, was still sitting in an encrypted file on the kitchen island. I had played the bait too convincingly. I had set a ticking clock on Clifton and Nadine, expecting them to make a move against the deed over the weekend. Instead, they had gone around me entirely. They had turned the legal system itself into a weapon and launched a preemptive strike with a speed and efficiency that left me breathless. Heavy authoritative knocks hammered against my front door. The sound rolled through the farmhouse like a Gunshot. I drew a slow breath and forced my racing heart to steady. I had to hold the facade together. I roughed up my hair, rounded my shoulders, and shuffled toward the foyer, letting my hands work up a visible, violent tremble. I threw the deadbolt and pulled the door open. A tall, stern-faced sheriff's deputy stood on the porch, the two social workers flanking him on either side. "Gordon Whitfield?" The deputy asked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Yes," I stammered, keeping my voice faint and hopelessly muddled. "What is happening? Is there some kind of problem?" The female social worker stepped forward, her expression a careful mask of clinical sympathy. "Mr. Whitfield, my name is Cecile. We are here from Adult Protective Services. We have received an emergency court order concerning your immediate welfare and the management of your estate." She handed me a thick stack of stapled legal documents. The heavy black text on the first page struck me like a fist to the sternum. It was an emergency ex parte conservatorship order, signed and stamped by a county judge just hours earlier. Ex parte meant it had been filed and granted in secret, without my knowledge, without my presence, without any opportunity for me to stand before a court and defend myself. It is a legal instrument reserved strictly for the most extreme cases of life-threatening mental collapse. I stared at the paperwork, letting my hands shake hard enough to rattle the pages. "This cannot be right," I whispered, looking blankly at the deputy. "I am fine. I am perfectly fine. I only just got up to have my coffee." "I am sorry, sir," the deputy said, his hand resting carefully on his service belt. "But the judge has temporarily removed your legal autonomy. You are no longer permitted to make financial or medical decisions on your own behalf, and you are not allowed to remain on this property without supervision. We are here to transport you to a secure medical facility for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation." Before I could even begin to form a reply, another vehicle came tearing up the driveway. It was Clifton's sleek silver luxury sedan. He hit the brakes hard, shoved it into park, and came sprinting toward the porch with Nadine right behind him. Nadine was crying, pressing a tissue to her face, performing the role of the shattered, heartbroken daughter with stunning conviction. Clifton pushed past the deputies and looked at me with a display of sorrow so elaborate it turned my stomach. "Oh, Dad," Nadine sobbed, reaching out to take hold of my arm. "I am so sorry it had to come to this. We tried so hard to care for you at home, but you were slipping away too fast. We had no choice but to protect you from yourself." I looked at her, then down at the documents, trembling in my grip. The attached exhibits told the whole horrifying story. Clifton hadn't used his Shadow Syndicate connections only for loans. He had used them to procure forged medical documentation. There were signed affidavits from 2 private out-of-state neurologists who had never laid eyes on me, swearing that I was suffering from aggressive late-stage chemical dementia. The documents laid out with surgical precision the exact symptoms the antipsychotic drugs had imposed on my body: the severe tremors, the lethargy, the outbursts of paranoid thinking, the night wandering into freezing temperatures. They had turned my own survival tactics against me. Every symptom I had faked to protect my investigation had been quietly filed as evidence for my institutionalization. Nadine had recorded my late-night wandering and my confused muttering, and she had laid those recordings before a judge as tragic proof that I was wholly incapable of managing a multi-million-dollar estate. I had told her I was giving the farm away to charity on Monday, and she had responded by legally erasing me on Friday morning. "Please, you have to listen to me," I begged, turning toward the social worker, my voice dropping into a desperate, frantic plea. "They are lying to you. They have been poisoning me." Cecile sighed and offered a sad, practiced smile. "We know about the medication, Mr. Whitfield. Your daughter has explained that you have been refusing your prescribed treatments and hiding your pills. That is why you are suffering these severe paranoid delusions. It is a recognized symptom of your condition. We are simply going to get you some help." Clifton smirked with undisguised triumph as the deputies guided me outside toward the waiting van. I dropped my head, hiding a quiet smile of my own. They had missed the burner phone in my pocket. The cold morning air cut through my thin cotton pajamas as the 2 deputies steered me toward the back of the transport van, their grips firm but not cruel. They genuinely believed they were handling a frail, confused old man, not a seasoned federal prosecutor. Before they let me step up into the vehicle, the taller deputy ran a standard pat-down. He worked through my pockets and came out with my regular smartphone and my heavy ring of house keys, handing them directly to Cecile, who placed them into a plastic evidence bag with a solemn air. They were confiscating my life piece by piece. But the deputy never checked the deep interior pocket of my heavy wool cardigan. That was where the small plastic burner phone sat pressed quietly against my chest, my last remaining lifeline to Leonard and to the world outside. I stood at the open doors of the van and put on a masterful performance of bewildered confusion. I let my lower lip go unsteady. I looked back at the farmhouse, letting my eyes roam, as though I couldn't make sense of any of it. Nadine was on the porch putting on a show that nearly matched my own. She was weeping openly, face buried in a crumpled tissue. Clifton stood beside her in the role of the steadfast, supportive husband. Cecile approached them both with professional warmth, resting a hand on Nadine's shoulder and assuring her that the facility would keep me safe and that the conservatorship would guard my assets from my deteriorating mind. It was sickening to observe. Nadine nodded, bravely dabbed a counterfeit tear from her cheek, and asked Cecile if she could have one last moment to say goodbye to her father. Cecile smiled gently and stepped aside. The deputies eased their hold on my arms, giving us the brief appearance of family privacy. Nadine walked slowly down the wooden steps and across the gravel driveway, her face a portrait of absolute devastation for anyone watching from a distance. But as she drew close, the grief in her eyes dissolved, replaced by a cold and triumphant gleam. She stepped into my space and pulled her arms around my neck in what looked from the outside like a desperate, loving embrace. I let my head rest against her shoulder, playing the bewildered patriarch to the end. She pressed her lips directly to my ear. Her breath was warm, but the words that followed were as cold as the frost on my lawn. "Do not fight it, Dad," she whispered, each word cutting like a razor. "You lost. We are in charge now. Just go quietly, and maybe I will put you in one of the nicer facilities." She pulled back, kissed me softly on the cheek, and released another loud, dramatic sob for the benefit of the social workers. I looked at her and let my hands shake, giving her the satisfaction of believing she had broken me. She turned and walked back to Clifton, burying her face against his chest. The deputies guided me gently up the steps and into the back of the transport van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind me, sealing the compartment in a pale, sterile half-light. I heard the lock engage from the outside. The engine rumbled to life, and the van began rolling slowly down the long dirt driveway, carrying me away from the only home I had known for 30 years. I sat on the hard plastic bench and listened to the steady rhythm of the tires on the asphalt. As the initial shock of the ambush began to recede, a dark and suffocating understanding settled over me. The bitter irony of where I sat was almost too profound to hold in my mind at once. I closed my eyes and let my thoughts carry me back exactly 25 years. During the height of my years in the federal prosecutor's office, I had been appointed to a special state commission tasked with rewriting the very conservatorship laws now being used to strip me of my freedom. At the time, there had been a spreading epidemic of financial predators targeting vulnerable seniors. I had spent long nights at my mahogany desk, working through legal precedents and drafting airtight statutes designed to freeze assets the moment severe cognitive decline could be established. I was the one who had drafted the specific emergency ex parte loophole. I had personally engineered that strict legal mechanism to let social services sidestep the usual courtroom delays, provided 2 neurologists signed sworn affidavits establishing an immediate threat to a vulnerable patient. I had championed that law. I had stood before the state legislature and argued passionately that rapid intervention was the only way to protect victims before their estates could be bled dry by predators. It was widely regarded as my legal masterpiece, a shield fashioned for the defenseless. And now my own daughter had turned that masterpiece into a weapon using the exact legal framework I had built to orchestrate the perfect crime. She had weaponized my own words, my own statutes, my own legacy to lock me away. The very people the law was designed to protect were the ones escorting me to a locked psychiatric ward. Her legal maneuver was brilliant and undeniable, but it rested entirely on absolute fraud. The medical records were forged. The symptoms had been chemically induced. The whole narrative was a fabrication beginning to end. They had successfully weaponized the law against its own creator. But they had made one fatal error. They assumed that by pulling me from the farm and confiscating my primary cell phone, they had cut off my ability to fight back. They believed the game was finished. They did not know about the hidden cameras capturing every corner of my study. They did not know that Leonard Farrell was sitting in his downtown office holding digital copies of their shadow banking debts, and the footage of Clifton accessing my safe. And most critically, they did not know about the small plastic burner phone resting securely against my chest. I slid my right hand inside the thick wool of my cardigan and traced the rectangular outline of the device with my thumb. The van lurched over a pothole, jostling me slightly, but I held myself perfectly still on the bench. I did not need to place a call right now. I simply needed to survive the mandatory psychiatric evaluation. I knew exactly how those evaluations functioned, the questions the doctors would ask, the cognitive tests they would administer, the specific behavioral markers they would flag. Once the harsh antipsychotics had cleared entirely from my system, my mind would be sharp as a scalpel. I would pass their tests without a stumble. I would prove my mental competence with ease. And the moment I found myself alone in a secure room, I would retrieve the burner phone and authorize Leonard to drop the hammer. Nadine and Clifton genuinely believed they had locked me away for good. They had absolutely no idea they had unknowingly handed me the perfect legal alibi, while my final trap closed firmly around their greedy throats. The transport van ride felt like a descent into a clinical purgatory. When we pulled up to the high-security behavioral health facility on the county's outskirts, I offered not a single trace of resistance. I understood that any display of anger, any assertion of my legal rights, or any demand to speak with an attorney would be immediately recorded as combative paranoia. Instead, I let my shoulders sag. I shuffled across the linoleum floors. I stared blankly at the intake nurses, offering only muddled murmurs when they asked for basic information. They logged my confiscated belongings, took my vital signs, and walked me down a long, sterile corridor to a private room. The heavy door swung shut, the electronic lock engaging with a solid, echoing thud. Through the narrow, reinforced glass panel in the door's center, I watched a burly orderly take up his post in the hallway. I was officially a prisoner of the state, confined within a system I had helped design. The room was deliberately bare, a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a single chair, a small adjoining bathroom stripped of mirrors. I sat on the edge of the rigid mattress and listened to the heavy footsteps of the orderly pacing outside. I waited through 2 agonizing hours, making certain the initial intake rounds had fully run their course. I tracked the facility's shifting rhythms until a deep quiet settled over the wing. Once I was sure I was not under active observation, I slipped my hand into the deep pocket of my wool cardigan. My fingers closed around the small plastic burner phone. Moving with excruciating slowness, I drew the device out and eased it beneath the thin mattress, tucking it into a secure spot against the frame insurance against a random room check. I sat without moving, eyes fixed on the door. The orderly had stopped pacing and appeared to be reading a magazine. I reached back under the mattress and retrieved the phone. I kept it low, shielded by my body, and dialed the screen, brightness down to its absolute lowest setting. The walls were thin, and even a whisper could carry to the staff. I typed a quick text to Leonard Farrell. I gave him the facility's name and laid out the ex parte emergency order, the forged medical affidavit, the rapid removal from the farm. It took 30 seconds for Leonard to reply. His text was brief, but the fury behind every word was unmistakable. They bypassed the standard docket, he wrote. They exploited a specific emergency loophole to strip your rights without a preliminary hearing. But that order is temporary. By law, they must convene a formal evidentiary hearing within 72 hours to solidify the conservatorship and make it permanent. That gives us exactly 3 days. I stared at the glowing screen, my legal mind shifting instantly into overdrive. 72 hours? It was a narrow window, but it was enough. I typed back, laying out the shape of our counterattack. We need to let them believe they have won, I wrote. File no immediate motions contesting the hold. Do not tip off their legal team. Let them walk into that courtroom Monday morning, convinced I am completely without defense. Leonard replied without hesitation. My forensic accountants have officially cracked through the shadow corporate layers. We have the paper trail connecting his venture capital firm directly to the Atlanta syndicate. We have the loan guarantees bearing your forged signature. My technical team has fully preserved the high-definition surveillance footage of Clifton opening your floor safe and photographing your assets. It is completely irrefutable. We will bury them. I read his words and felt a surge of cold, methodical satisfaction. Every piece of their fraud needed to surface simultaneously. I directed Leonard to silently subpoena the 2 out-of-state neurologists who had signed the fraudulent medical affidavit. We both understood those doctors had almost certainly been paid from syndicate funds, and under the weight of federal perjury charges, they would collapse on the witness stand. I also instructed him to have a sweeping federal injunction ready to file the instant the hearing opened. We were going to strike them with a wave of legal destruction so total they would not have time to draw breath. Leonard agreed to the strategy. His final message carried a hard warning. You have to play your part flawlessly, Gordon. The doctors at that facility are going to evaluate you. They will try to draw out a reaction. Nadine will almost certainly visit to build a record of your cognitive decline. You cannot break character. If they suspect for even a moment that your mind is intact, they may panic and signal the syndicate to move on the farm before the hearing. I will be the perfect broken old man, I typed back. I will see you in court. I powered the burner phone down and tucked it back into its hiding place deep inside the mattress. I lay back on the rigid bed and stared up at the sterile white ceiling tiles. The bitter irony of my situation settled over me again, but this time it carried no feeling of defeat. It felt like a necessary crucible. I was a prisoner locked inside a psychiatric ward, stripped of my identity, my property, and my freedom. But inside my own mind, I was completely free, and I was holding a lit match to the powder keg they had built around themselves. The next 48 hours would be an absolute trial of my endurance and my ability to perform. I adopted a vacant, hollow stare. When the facility psychiatrists arrived to evaluate me, I answered their questions with slow, deliberate confusion. I mixed up dates. I claimed not to know what city I was in. I asked for Loretta. I let my hands tremble, and I refused the bland cafeteria food, allowing my physical appearance to deteriorate in line with the forged medical profile Nadine had constructed. The doctors took meticulous notes, nodding with practiced sympathy, wholly convinced they were witnessing a tragic case of rapid-onset dementia. Nadine visited on Sunday afternoon. She walked into my small room, accompanied by an orderly carrying a bouquet of cheap flowers. She wore a solemn expression, but her eyes danced with absolute victory. She pulled the chair close to my bed and spoke to me the way you'd address a small child. She told me not to worry about the farm, assuring me that Clifton was taking care of all the paperwork to keep everything in order. I looked up at her and let a thin ribbon of saliva slip from the corner of my mouth, murmuring nonsense under my breath. She smiled that cold reptilian pull of her lips and patted the back of my hand. Then she walked out certain her inheritance was already in the bag. She had no idea she had just stepped into the final hours of her freedom. The trap was locked. Monday morning came in cold and gray, a relentless drizzle soaking the pavement. The facility staff roused me just before dawn to get ready for the transport to the county courthouse. A stern orderly handed me a plastic bag containing a change of clothes that Nadine had supposedly packed and sent over from the farmhouse. It was a calculated insult. In place of one of my tailored suits, she had sent a faded plaid country shirt, a pair of worn denim trousers, and my scuffed leather work boots. She had even tucked in an old battered canvas hat I kept for gardening. The message could not have been clearer. She wanted me walking into that courtroom looking exactly like a confused, unkempt farmer who had lost his grip on reality and basic hygiene alike. I dressed slowly, letting my hands tremble as I fumbled with the shirt buttons. I left my hair uncombed. The gray stubble on my jaw stayed exactly where it was. When the transport deputies arrived to collect me, I shuffled along with my head hung low, gripping that worn hat against my chest. I looked like a man who had already given up. The drive to the courthouse took 45 minutes. I sat in the back of the transport van and watched the city street smear past through the wire mesh window. My mind was razor sharp, turning over every possible angle of the legal confrontation ahead. Leonard and I had mapped out our moves with precision the night before. I knew exactly what part I had to play. The van rolled into the secure loading bay at the rear of the courthouse. The heavy doors swung open, and the freezing rain struck my face. The deputies steered me up the concrete steps and through the bleak institutional corridors of the holding area. We moved past holding cells and hurrying clerks threading toward the designated civil family courtrooms. Every step was deliberate. I dragged my left boot, slightly mimicking the physical deterioration Nadine had described in her fraudulent medical filings. We finally reached the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4. A deputy pushed them open, and a hush dropped over the room the moment we walked in. I kept my eyes trained on the polished floorboards, but my peripheral vision pulled in everything. The courtroom was relatively sparse standard for a closed conservatorship hearing. At the plaintiff table sat Nadine, dressed in a conservative dark navy suit that telegraphed responsible daughter. Beside her sat Clifton in a tailored charcoal suit, his face arranged in an expression of deep-studied solemnity. They had brought in a high-powered litigator from a prestigious city firm, a tall man with slicked-back hair and an expensive silk tie. I was guided to the defense table. I dropped into the seat heavily and set my worn hat on the table in front of me. I let my shoulders fold inward, my chin drifting toward my chest. I risked one brief upward glance. Nadine was watching me. A faint, vicious smirk played at the very edges of her mouth, the look of a predator watching a cornered animal take its last breath. Clifton leaned over and murmured something in her ear, shaking his head with a performance of hollow, patronizing pity. They were completely certain they had pulled off the perfect crime. The bailiff announced the judge. Everyone in the room rose except for me. I stayed seated, playing the role of a man too addled to understand basic courtroom protocol. The deputy behind me gave my shoulder a soft nudge, but I only let out a low, rattling breath of confusion. The judge, a severe-looking woman with graying hair and sharp-framed glasses, settled into her elevated bench. She looked down at me with an expression that mixed professional detachment with quiet sympathy. Nadine's high-priced attorney wasted no time launching into his opening statement, speaking with the smooth, polished rhythm of a man accustomed to winning without opposition. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying through the still chamber. "We appear before the court today under deeply tragic circumstances. We are petitioning to convert the emergency conservatorship of Mr. Gordon Whitfield into a permanent arrangement." This was not a decision his family reached without anguish, he continued, but it was one driven by absolute and unavoidable necessity to protect his physical safety and his financial well-being. The attorney lifted a thick binder from the table and held it up for the judge. He proceeded to lay out what he plainly believed was an airtight case of severe irreversible dementia. He guided the judge through the forged medical records with clinical efficiency. He cited the sworn affidavits from 2 out-of-state neurologists cataloging a rapid, aggressive cognitive collapse. He read aloud passages describing my supposed symptoms: violent paranoia, an inability to recognize family members, total loss of short-term memory. He constructed a masterful, devastating portrait of a man whose mind had crumbled into a dark and terrifying void. I sat through every lie without moving a muscle. My eyes stayed fixed on the scuffed toes of my work boots. The lawyer then pivoted to the financial dimensions of the estate. He described the farm's vast acreage and the intricate investment portfolios I managed. Leaving an estate of that magnitude in the hands of a man plagued by severe delusions, he argued, was not merely irresponsible. It was actively dangerous. To drive the point home, the attorney directed the courtroom's attention to a large monitor positioned near the witness stand. He played the video Nadine had captured on her cell phone the night of my manufactured breakdown. The screen filled with the image of me standing barefoot on the freezing gravel in thin pajamas, weeping and screaming for my deceased wife. The audio of that pathetic, distraught rambling flooded the courtroom. Even knowing every second of it had been a calculated performance, it was hard to watch. The judge studied the screen, her expression shifting into unmistakable sorrow. The attorney let the image hang in the air a moment before continuing. "As the court can plainly observe, Your Honor, this man poses a serious danger to himself. He wanders into freezing conditions. He suffers vivid hallucinations. He is wholly incapable of making sound decisions about his medical care or his considerable assets. We respectfully ask that his daughter Nadine be granted full and permanent authority over his estate, both to guarantee his safety and to protect what he spent a lifetime building." The attorney closed his binder and stepped back with a measured, respectful nod toward the bench. Nadine reached over and lightly squeezed Clifton's hand, pressing a white tissue to her cheek to catch a single carefully produced tear. The entire room held its breath. Everyone was waiting for me to lash out, to protest, to dissolve into helpless sobbing. I did not move. I kept my head lowered, eyes anchored to the floorboards, and let them drink in their false triumph while I waited for the final legal trap to close it around them completely. The silence inside courtroom 4 stretched through several long, agonizing moments. Judge Edmund Calloway adjusted his heavy, dark-framed glasses and released a quiet sigh. He looked down at the documents spread before him on the elevated bench, straightening the forged medical affidavit and the fraudulent financial assessments into a tidy stack. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as he gathered himself to rule. Nadine shifted in her seat across the aisle, the fabric of her navy suit whispering against the polished wood of the plaintiff table. She produced another soft, manufactured sniffle, playing her part right up to the wire. The high-priced litigator beside her cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie with an air of complete confidence. As far as he was concerned, he was simply closing out a routine, unopposed conservatorship hearing. Judge Calloway finally lifted his wooden gavel and cleared his throat to speak. Mr. Whitfield. Judge Calloway began his voice, carrying that gentle, practiced authority, designed to calm those suffering from cognitive decline. I understand that proceedings like this can feel deeply confusing and frightening. I need you to look at me, sir, so I can be certain you understand what is taking place in this courtroom today. I held my chin against my chest for 3 full seconds. I wanted the anticipation to crest. I wanted Nadine and Clifton to taste the absolute peak of their false triumph before I brought the whole thing crashing down around them. Then slowly and deliberately, I raised my head. I let the slumped curve of my spine straighten. I pressed both hands flat against the defense table, and the fabricated tremors stopped dead. I raised my eyes and fixed my gaze directly on the man seated behind the elevated mahogany bench. The change that moved across Judge Edmund Calloway's face was instantaneous and violently dramatic. The moment our eyes met, every trace of professional sympathy drained away. The color bled from his cheeks with startling speed, leaving his skin the pallor of old parchment. The heavy wooden gavel slipped from his fingers and struck the sound block with a dull, hollow clatter that rang through the silent room. He physically recoiled into his high-backed leather chair shoulders, pressing hard against the upholstery, as though a jolt of electricity had passed through him. He lifted a shaking hand, pulled off his glasses, and blinked rapidly as if trying to dismiss an impossible vision. His mouth fell open. Nothing came out. The entire courtroom went rigid, paralyzed by the sudden terrifying shift in the presiding judge. "My God," Judge Calloway whispered, his voice barely above a breath, yet carrying cleanly through the hushed chamber without any need for a microphone. "Is it really him?" The slick litigator representing my daughter looked on in deep confusion. He stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, his smooth delivery faltering for the very first time. "Is everything all right? Should we call a medical professional for the respondent?" Judge Calloway did not spare the lawyer a glance. His eyes stayed locked onto my face, widening with a mixture of absolute shock, deep respect, and unmistakable fear. He was not looking at a broken, unkempt farmer in a plaid shirt and scuffed boots. He was staring straight into the past. He was looking at the man who had forged his entire career. "Yes, Edmund," I said. My voice was no longer frail or muddled. It filled the courtroom with the deep, commanding baritone I had spent 30 years building across the most serious criminal prosecutions in the state. It has been a very long time. The sound of my true voice hit Nadine like a physical blow. I heard her sharp gasp, a sudden ragged intake of breath that laid her panic bare. Clifton went rigid in his chair, his posture snapping upright as the confident smirk was wiped clean from his face. The high-priced attorney swung his head back and forth between the judge and me, utterly baffled by the authority suddenly radiating from the man he had just spent 20 minutes portraying as a helpless, delusional wreck. He opened his mouth to object, but Judge Calloway raised a trembling hand and silenced him. "You are Gordon Whitfield," Judge Calloway stated, leaning far forward over the bench, abandoning every standard convention of courtroom decorum. "You are the Gordon Whitfield." The lawyer practically stumbled in his expensive shoes. "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney cut in his voice, climbing toward panic. "That is the respondent. We have fully established his identity and the severity of his cognitive deterioration in our medical filings." Judge Calloway swung his gaze toward the lawyer, eyes burning with sudden fierce contempt. "Shut your mouth, counselor!" The judge barked, his voice hitting the walls like a thunderclap. "You have absolutely no idea who is sitting at that defense table. 30 years ago, I was a struggling, desperate law intern. I made a terrible mistake that nearly ended my career before it had properly begun. The man sitting right there stepped in, took me under his wing, and saved my professional life." The courtroom was suffocatingly still. Nadine was breathing in short, shallow bursts, her hands gripping the edge of the plaintiff table so hard her knuckles went white. Clifton stared at me with wide, frightened eyes, the realization finally breaking through that the helpless old man he had been drugging was a carefully constructed performance. Judge Calloway turned back to me, his voice dropping into a register of genuine reverence. "He is the most ruthless, brilliant, and honorable federal prosecutor this state has ever produced. The judge went on addressing the frozen room while speaking squarely to my daughter's paralyzed attorney. He authored the very conservatorship statutes you are attempting to invoke in my courtroom this morning. He drafted the emergency ex parte provisions you filed on Friday. Are you seriously standing there and telling me that the man who built this state's financial protection laws has lost his mind? The slick litigator retreated a step, his professional composure in ruins. He glanced down at his thick binder of forged records, then looked over at Nadine, his eyes demanding an explanation she had no way of providing. Your Honor, the lawyer managed his voice thin and uncertain. We have sworn affidavits from 2 certified medical professionals. The judge's hand came down flat against the surface of his bench with a crack. I do not care what is in that binder, Judge Calloway thundered. I know the man sitting before me. I know his mind. The atmosphere in the room lurched so violently it felt as though the air itself had thickened. I sat perfectly still and watched the terror take hold of my daughter and her husband. I had them exactly where I wanted them. The stage was finally set. The arrogant attorney let his grip go slack, and the heavy binder crashed to the polished floor. Nadine buried her face in her trembling hands and let out a genuine suffocating sob of pure defeat. The truth landed on both of them at the same instant. The perfect crime was over. I had won. I let the silence press down a moment longer, letting the full weight of their situation squeeze the last of the air from their lungs. Then I slowly opened my fingers. The battered canvas hat dropped from my grasp and hit the polished floor with a soft, dismissive thud. I set both palms on the defense table and pushed myself to my feet. The stooped, fragile posture I had sustained for weeks evaporated on the spot. I drew my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and rose to my full height. The trembling in my hands was gone. My eyes hardened into the cold, penetrating stare that had once reduced hardened criminals to confessions in interrogation rooms. I looked across at opposing counsel, watching the arrogant litigator shrink back as though struck by an invisible force. The confidence that had been plastered across his face moments before collapsed into pure, unguarded uncertainty. I turned toward the bench. Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the stillness like a finely honed blade. With the permission of the court, I am formally requesting to waive my right to appointed counsel. I will be representing myself in this matter. Judge Edmund Calloway did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. Permission is unequivocally granted, Mr. Whitfield. The judge replied, his voice weighted with profound respect. The floor is entirely yours. Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a resounding crash. Leonard Farrell strode into the chamber, moving with the relentless momentum of an approaching storm. He wore his signature charcoal suit and radiated absolute authority. Behind him, 2 paralegals pushed a heavy metal trolley loaded with 6 large, tightly packed banker's boxes. The wheels squeaked sharply against the floorboards, shattering the room's tense quiet. Leonard marched straight down the center aisle, completely ignoring the frantic, terrified stares of my daughter and her husband. He swept past their table without offering them so much as a glance of recognition and positioned the trolley directly at my side. He gave me a single grim nod and stepped back. I rested my hand on the topmost box. Your Honor, I continued, my tone ringing with absolute clarity. The petition before this court today is not a tragic plea for the protection of a deteriorating patriarch. It is the final desperate act of a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. The petitioners are attempting to use this courtroom to complete a $15 million fraud. I turned and looked directly at Clifton. His face was slick with cold sweat. He looked like a man standing on a gallows. I reached into the first box and drew out a thick stack of printed transcripts and financial records. Opposing counsel has presented sworn medical affidavits detailing my supposed cognitive collapse. I stated, moving slowly toward the center of the room. He claims 2 independent neurologists diagnosed me with late-stage chemical dementia. I set the documents on the edge of the judge's bench. What counsel does not know is that my legal team served federal subpoenas on both of those out-of-state doctors yesterday evening. When confronted with the prospect of federal perjury charges and the immediate loss of their medical licenses, they became remarkably forthcoming. They confessed to accepting wire transfers of $50,000 each in exchange for signing those blank affidavits. I turned to look at the slick litigator. The man looked physically ill. He began frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase, shaking his head in a desperate bid to distance himself from the wreckage closing in around him. I did not stop. I drew a small, clear plastic evidence bag from my pocket and held it up for the room to see. Inside were the white capsules Nadine had been forcing on me. The symptoms described in those forged medical records were indeed real. I said, my voice dropping a degree colder with each word. Because my daughter, the devoted petitioner, had been systematically poisoning me for the past 4 weeks, swapping out my daily vitamin supplements with a heavy, dangerous regimen of unprescribed antipsychotic medications engineered to produce severe tremors, lethargy, and temporary paranoia. She used a chemical restraint to manufacture the precise visual evidence she needed to strip away my autonomy. Nadine let out a strangled, pitiful whimper and buried her face deeper in her hands, but she was only half the equation. I turned my full, withering attention onto Clifton. He tried to look away, but I stepped toward their table and forced him to hold my gaze. The medical fraud was nothing more than the key to unlock the vault. That the true motive, I told the court, my voice carrying off the high ceiling, sits at the plaintiff table. Clifton had projected the image of a thriving venture capitalist. In reality, his firm was a bankrupt shell. He had not generated a profitable return in 4 years. He was $15 million in debt to an illicit shadow banking syndicate operating out of Atlanta, a violent organization that does not accept excuses for missed payments. I moved back to the trolley and retrieved a tablet connecting it to the courtroom monitors. To save his own life, he needed collateral. He needed my farm, my acreage, and my financial portfolios. When he could not persuade me to sign them over willingly, he stole the combination to my floor safe. The courtroom screens came to life. Crystal clear surveillance footage began to roll. Every eye in the room tracked Clifton as he crept into my study, peeled back the heavy antique braided wool rug, opened the concealed safe, and methodically photographed my private deeds and bearer bonds. The silence was total as the digital record of his undeniable felony played out before the judge. He used those photographs to forge my signature on multiple loan guarantee documents. I stated, my voice steady over the damning footage. He pledged my entire estate to a criminal syndicate to cover his shadow debt. The emergency conservatorship filed on Friday was his last-ditch attempt to complete the legal transfer of those assets before I could deed the farm to a state charity. He was not protecting me. He was feeding me to his creditors to save himself. The arrogant litigator snapped his briefcase shut, abandoned his clients at the table, and literally sprinted for the heavy wooden doors at the rear of the chamber. He wanted no part of the colossal criminal conspiracy I had just torn open before the court. Nadine was hyperventilating, clawing at the collar of her expensive navy suit, unable to escape the crushing weight of what was descending on her. Clifton sat completely frozen in his chair, eyes hollow and empty as the surveillance footage looped on the screens above him. They were utterly broken, trapped inside a catastrophe entirely of their own creation. I turned back to face the elevated bench, looking squarely at Judge Edmund Calloway. "I am not a helpless old man, Your Honor. I am Gordon Whitfield, and I am filing formal criminal charges against both of them right here, right now." I reached into the second banker's box Leonard had positioned beside me and withdrew a thick blue evidentiary folder. I opened it and produced a certified laboratory document, holding it up so the judge could see the embossed seal clearly. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "The medical affidavit opposing counsel submitted relies on symptoms I genuinely displayed over the past month. Those symptoms, however, were not the product of cognitive decline. They were chemically induced. I am entering into evidence a comprehensive independent toxicology report. 4 days before they removed me from my home, my attorney arranged a covert blood and hair follicle analysis. The results conclusively establish a systematic daily ingestion of a powerful unprescribed antipsychotic medication. I drew a secondary document from the folder, a crisp financial statement. I am also submitting the corresponding financial trace. This is a certified credit card statement belonging to my daughter, Nadine Whitfield. It records a cash transaction at an out-of-state unregulated pharmacy exactly 5 weeks ago. The purchase aligns precisely with the dosage and timeline of the chemical agents found in my bloodstream. She did not merely observe my decline. She engineered it, poisoning her own father to fabricate the medical foundation for this conservatorship. A collective gasp swept through the sparse gallery. Nadine clutched her throat, her chest heaving, as she let out a piercing, high-pitched wail of absolute panic. The composed facade she had maintained for weeks was crumbling to dust in front of my eyes. She began shaking uncontrollably, her gaze darting around the room as if searching for a door that wasn't there. I did not pause to let either of them recover. I reached into the third box and produced a portable, high-capacity digital drive. I handed it to the bailiff, who formally presented it to the bench. This drive contains the raw, unedited 4K high-resolution footage captured by the concealed cameras in my private study. I explained, my tone sharpening to a razor's edge. Opposing counsel glimpsed a brief segment of this recording, but the complete time-stamped file is now formally entered into the permanent court record. It shows Clifton systematically defeating my security measures. You can observe him using specialized tools to work through the analog combination dial on my floor safe. The visual resolution is so precise that the serial numbers on the bearer bonds he photographed are fully legible. Clifton was shaking hard now. The tailored charcoal suit he wore seemed to hang loose on his collapsing frame. His mouth worked open, producing fractured, incoherent syllables as he groped for some lie that could account for the unambiguous digital proof of his burglary. There was none. He had been caught in the act inside my inner sanctum, stealing the very financial instruments he had claimed to want to protect. His hands locked onto the edge of the table, knuckles going stark white under the unbearable pressure of the moment. Before Clifton could form a coherent sentence, I pulled the final and most devastating piece of evidence from the boxes. I brought a heavy stack of forensic accounting audits down onto the defense table with both hands. The impact cracked through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. The burglary was not an isolated incident, I announced to the paralyzed room. I am submitting the complete, unredacted financial trace of Clifton's venture capital firm. These records, verified by 3 independent forensic auditors, expose a massive concealed shadow debt. He owes $15 million to an illicit syndicate, a liability that has been accruing compounding interest for 4 years. I raised a series of legal contracts, their pages bristling with bright red evidentiary tags. To satisfy his violent creditors, Clifton needed collateral. He needed my farm, my liquid assets, and my entire estate. I am entering into evidence these loan guarantee documents bearing my forged signature. Clifton used the photographs taken from my safe to construct a flawless replica of my legal authorization. He pledged everything I spent a lifetime building to cover his own reckless criminal debts. The emergency ex parte order they filed on Friday was their absolute last resort to complete the legal transfer of my estate before the syndicate came for them. They needed me declared legally incompetent, so I could not contest the fraudulent transfers scheduled to execute this very afternoon. Judge Edmund Calloway stared at the mountain of undeniable evidence before him. His expression shifted from deep shock into a mask of pure, righteous judicial fury. He turned his gaze down to the plaintiff table, his eyes carrying a contempt so intense it seemed to chill the air in the room. Nadine was screaming now, a continuous hysterical cascade of denials and frantic apologies that swallowed the steady sound of rain against the courtroom windows. She clawed at her husband's arm, begging him to undo a disaster that was already far beyond undoing. Her carefully arranged hair had come apart, her expensive suit twisted and creased as she buckled under the reality of what was coming. She looked precisely like the terrified, cornered creature she had believed me to be just minutes before. Clifton did not look at his wife. He looked at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. The primal animalistic drive to survive suddenly overwhelmed whatever remained of his rational judgment. He shoved Nadine hard, sending her chair lurching backward with a violent, callous thrust. She went down onto the polished floorboards in a tangle of navy fabric and terrified sobs, hands grasping at empty air. Clifton vaulted over the plaintiff table and tore down the center aisle toward the exit. He was running for his life, completely blinded by adrenaline, desperate to put distance between himself and the twin certainties of federal prison and the syndicate waiting outside for their money. He did not make it halfway. Judge Calloway brought his gavel down the crack, ringing out like a thunderclap across the vaulted ceiling. "Bailiffs, secure that man immediately." The judge's voice carried absolute command over the entire room. 3 heavily armed bailiffs converged on Clifton with swift, practiced precision. The largest officer hit him from the side in a punishing shoulder tackle, driving him hard into the solid oak of the spectator benches. The impact knocked the wind from Clifton's lungs with a sickening thud. He struck the polished floor and thrashed wildly in blind, desperate panic. The officers gave him no ground. They wrenched his arms behind his back and pressed his cheek flat against the cold floorboards. The sharp, unmistakable ratcheting of steel handcuffs engaging rang through the chamber, sealing his inescapable ruin. The trap had not merely closed, it had crushed them both. I stood straight behind the defense table, watching my treacherous daughter weep uncontrollably on the floor, while her husband lay pinned and broken beside the bench. The law I had given my life to defending had delivered its ultimate merciless judgment upon the people who had engineered my suffering. Judge Edmund Calloway did not waste a second. The silence was so complete, I could hear the rain driving hard against the tall glass windows, washing away weeks of suffocating tension. He glanced down at the opposing attorney, who was still trying to quietly nudge his expensive briefcase toward the aisle, eager to escape the toxic fallout radiating from his clients. Judge Calloway raised his hand, one stern finger leveled at the bench. He declared the emergency ex parte conservatorship entirely revoked null and void from the very moment of its fraudulent inception. He affirmed on the record that I was in full possession of my mental faculties, my autonomy, and every one of my legal rights. And he did not stop there. He ordered the remaining bailiffs to seal the doors, then issued bench warrants for the immediate arrest of both Nadine Whitfield and Clifton Hargrove. The charges he read aloud echoed through the chamber like a requiem severe elder abuse, willful and premeditated fraud forgery of financial instruments, and most damning of all, the attempted poisoning and chemical imprisonment of a vulnerable senior citizen. He directed the district attorney to freeze every asset connected to Clifton and his shell venture capital firm. The trap I had assembled in the dark of a psychiatric room had fully sprung, catching them entirely off guard. The courtroom dissolved into frantic, chaotic motion. Additional deputies poured through the double doors in response to the judge's call for backup. 2 officers hauled Clifton up from the floor, dragging him by his cuffed arms as he continued to thrash and sputter incoherent pleas. His expensive charcoal suit was torn at the shoulder and dusted with grime from the floorboards, a fitting reflection of his ruined life. Nadine realized she was next. She tried to rise her legs, buckling beneath her. As the reality of federal prison solidified before her eyes, a female deputy stepped close and instructed her to place her hands behind her back. Nadine resisted, weeping hysterically, shaking her head as the cold steel bracelets clicked tight around her wrists. She turned her desperate eyes toward me, mascara running in the dark streaks down her pale cheeks. Her mouth opened to scream, but the deputies were already moving her toward the side exit and the holding cells beyond. Leonard Farrell stood at my side, arms folded across his chest, watching the systematic dismantling of the people who had tried to steal my life. We exchanged a silent nod of mutual understanding. The job was not merely done. It had been executed with absolute terrifying perfection. I walked out of the courtroom with my shoulders back and my mind sharper than it had felt in years. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, muffling the chaos of the chamber. The corridor beyond was cold and institutional marble walls, flickering fluorescent lights. I saw the deputies steering Nadine toward the main transport elevator. When she spotted me stepping into the hallway, a fresh surge of frantic energy overtook her. She fought against the officer's grip with every bit of strength she had left, throwing her body forward and dropping hard onto her knees on the marble floor, directly in my path. The deputies tried to pull her upright, but she went completely limp, wrapping her cuffed hands around my scuffed leather work boots and sobbing a raw, guttural sound of utter panic and total defeat. Dad, please!" She screamed, her voice carrying the full length of the empty corridor. "You have to stop this. You cannot let them take me. I am your daughter. I am your blood. Please, I am begging you." I looked down at the woman, weeping at my feet. I saw the same face I had kissed goodnight when she was a child, the same eyes that had looked back at me across the dinner table for 30 years. But I also saw the person who had dissolved unprescribed antipsychotic pills into my evening tea. I saw the predator who had leaned close and whispered cruel, triumphant words into my ear as I was loaded into the back of a psychiatric transport van. I felt no pity, not a trace. My heart had become a stone fortress entirely sealed against the tears of a traitor. I did not bend down. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a quiet, lethal calm that cut straight through her hysterical wails. "You bled that out of yourself the day you put poison in my cup." My voice carried no warmth, No waver, nothing human at all. I stepped back, drawing my boots free of her grasp. I turned my back on her and walked the length of the corridor, the steady rhythm of my footsteps echoing off the marble. I did not look back not once as her screams faded behind the heavy steel doors of the transport elevator. The justice system moves with remarkable speed when presented with irrefutable high-definition evidence and the righteous fury of an angry judge. Within 6 months, the legal proceedings reached their conclusion with devastating finality. Clifton Hargrove was found guilty on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy. The shadow banking syndicate to which he was indebted was simultaneously dismantled by federal authorities working from the forensic accounting trails Leonard Farrell had painstakingly assembled. Clifton was sentenced to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He surrendered his firm, his reputation, and his freedom, trading tailored suits for standard institutional orange. Nadine faced an equally severe reckoning. The medical fraud and elder abuse charges stripped away her pristine social standing and every dollar she had accumulated. She lost the right to conduct any form of business management in the state. She was handed a lengthy sentence in a state correctional facility, cut off entirely from the luxury and privilege she had betrayed her own father to obtain. Their greed had been their absolute undoing, a poison far more potent than anything they had slipped into my drink. With my enemies behind bars, I returned to the sanctuary of my farm. I worked closely with Leonard Farrell to establish a comprehensive bulletproof legal trust. I transferred the bulk of my financial portfolio and the deed to the farm into that protected entity. It was built specifically to fund legal defenses and protective services for vulnerable senior citizens ensnared in abusive conservatorships. I made certain that the very laws I had written could never again be turned against the innocent. It was a crisp morning in early November. The sun was just cresting the rolling hills of the property, casting long golden shadows across the frost-covered grass. I stepped out onto the wooden planks of my back porch, a steaming heavy porcelain mug of black coffee warming my hands. The farm was completely still, save for the chirping of the morning birds. I stood there alone, breathing in the cold air finally and completely at peace. Betrayal often arrives wearing the familiar face of those we love most, hiding greed behind a carefully manufactured mask of concern. We spend our lives building a legacy to shelter our children, only to discover that true security does not rest in the wealth we accumulate, but in the firm boundaries we have the courage to hold. If you've stayed with me this far, then you already know this story didn't end the way Nadine and Clifton planned, and I'm grateful you were here to see it through to the end. Looking back, I understand now what those weeks cost me, not just the sleepless nights or the chemical fog they forced into my body, but the grief of watching people I had loved reveal themselves as something I never imagined they could be. I believe God does not allow that kind of suffering without purpose. The patience it demanded, the discipline it required, all of it was shaping something in me that a comfortable life never could have reached. What I lost in trust, I recovered in clarity. If this story leaves you with anything worth carrying, let it be this. Document everything. The moment something feels wrong, start a record. Silence is not proof of innocence. If someone works to isolate you from your own judgment, that is not concern, that is control. Name it early. Never confuse a familiar face with a trustworthy one. Love and loyalty are not the same thing. And if you are ever made to feel like a burden by the very people who were supposed to protect you, remember your experience, your history, and your mind still belong to you. This is the kind of family revenge story that I know touches something real for a lot of people, especially those of us who are adults, 50 plus, and understand what it means to have built something over a lifetime only to feel it slipping through your hands. If any part of what Gordon went through sounds familiar, please share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. And if you haven't yet, I'd be honored to have you subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories. There are more stories here, each one carrying a truth worth your time. Thank you for listening. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.